Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines. So the long campaign is almost over, Dave.
3 more days, and then we have some real election results. So for those of you who are political junkies like we are, Tuesday couldn't come fast enough, although we hope that everything goes peaceful, right? That's the big hope.
That would be nice. Yeah, I don't know. The question is, do we have going to withdrawal the day after when there's no new polls and new punditry to analyze and read about? Might be a good thing for us, a little healthy break from all that. And so let's go right to the headlines. And we're going to start with the state of the race as we're recording Friday evening. The latest betting odds, composite at least, at RealClearPolitics, have Biden with a 64.1% chance of winning and Donald Trump at 34.9%. And if you look at some of the simulation sites, which seem to be proliferating, 538 has them at 89%. The Economist is up to 97% for Biden. And 270 to win says 87% chance of victory for Biden. Somewhere around 90% chance of victory according to these simulations, which interestingly enough is exactly where we were in 2016. That was kind of the composite projection, was a 90% chance of a Biden victory. Now, it's fair to say that at least on the 538 site, they certainly emphasize that unlikely events happen. And so the fact that something is a 10% chance is not the same thing as saying it's a 0% chance. And 1 in 10 things happen, about 1 time in 10. But of course, if it were to happen again, that would be 2 unlikely events in a row. That would suggest perhaps maybe there's a problem with the models. We want to talk a little bit about the models, what's behind those models and the polls and some of the analysis around that. There was an interesting column by Rich Lowry of National Review about a week and a half ago, which was summarizing a conversation that he'd had with Robert Cahaly of the Trafalgar Group on Lowry's podcast. And if you know the name Trafalgar Group, you probably know it because in 2016, it was the one polling organization that had Trump leading in both Michigan and Pennsylvania, and also got the Electoral College vote exactly right. And so at that point, Trafalgar was involved in a number of campaign-related things, and polling was kind of a part of that. And since then, they've gone more or less into all polling all the time on the strength of their success in 2016. And it's interesting, if you go on RealClearPolitics now or look at other sites that have various polls that have been taken in recent days, you'll find that the Trafalgar polls consistently have better numbers for President Trump than at least the composite averages do. So trying to understand that, Lowry asked him about some of the methodological differences between his approach and the approach of other pollsters. And Cahaly focused in the response to that on this idea of social desirability bias. And maybe you've heard about the idea of the shy voter, the shy conservative, the shy Trump voter. This is the more technical term for this, at least as Cahaly is using it. Basically, recognizing that people don't want to be judged for their preferences by a person who's giving a poll. And so they de-emphasize live calls and focus more on automatic calls, robocalls, sometimes call those, texts, emails, do some other things digitally online. So they try to make it as clear as possible to the person who's being polled that this is anonymous. It's okay to say what you think. And then they also will often ask a follow-up question where they ask what you think your neighbors will vote and how you think your state or overall your community will vote. And they use that to adjust the results, basically on the assumption that sometimes we're more honest about what we perceive our neighbors and associates will do than we are about ourselves. And so they sort of assume that looking at that will give you an indication is there a gap between what the person's saying and what they actually intend to do. So this is kind of the basic approach that they've taken at Trafalgar, and at least this is what they attribute to their success in 2016. So what do you make of all that, Dave, as you think about this outlier in 2016, an outlier in 2020? How should we think about that as we look at the polls and try to project the race?
Well, I definitely think that context matters when you're asked a question. Who are you voting for president? If you're in California where you see, many Biden signs all around you, you're not probably going to walk through your neighborhood, with a Trump t-shirt on, and vice versa. If you're in Texas or parts of Texas, right, that are very red, there does seem to be a tendency, right, to want to just stay shy or quiet in that circumstance. So I think that there's something to that. I wonder about those who take calls and spend a long time on them. I think those tend to be very politicized people. So I don't know if you're getting a really good representation of things with the telephone call. So maybe the robocall is a better thing because it's quick and you get your preferences out there quickly and then go from there. So yeah, I think that the biggest thing for me, Matt, is when I look at how far off the polling was in 2016 to the real result, I ask myself, well, why is that the case? And, have things been fixed so that will not be the case in 2020? So I kind of probably give Donald Trump 3 to 5 points on any of these. And to me, that's why it's a closer race than many of the pollsters have it.
Yeah, that is the big question. So interestingly enough, after 2016 and after, it was really the state level polls that were off. The national polls, the average was 3 points in Hillary's favor. The result was 2 points in Hillary's favor. So obviously that's within a reasonable margin there. But it was state level polls in the key, especially Midwestern battleground states, and some states that turned out to be battleground states that no one realized were battleground states, perhaps except Trafalgar. Those were the polls that were off by the most. And so there's always an association, right? There's the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And after the last election in 2016, they did some academic research and some studies of how they got things wrong. And again, they focused on those state level polls because that was really where the problem was. And their conclusion focused on 3 factors as they tried to figure out why they made this mistake, collectively speaking. Number 1, late deciding voters. Number 2, a shift in the voting habits of voters without a college education that hadn't been anticipated by the pollsters as they were making up their sample and adjusting for the differences among the people that were in their sample. And then thirdly, that more Trump voters than Clinton voters didn't reveal their preference until after the election. What they mean by that is that there's actually polls where they take a poll before the election and then they go back to the same people after the election and say, who did you actually vote for? And they compare the results. And there were more people who had a different result on the Trump side than there were on the Clinton side in the direction of Trump. In other words, there were more people that voted for Trump in retrospect than had said that at the time that the poll was taken before the election. And now that could be the shy Trump effect or the shy conservative effect, or it could be that people were changing their mind at the last minute, that late-breaking, late-deciding voter phenomenon again. So they looked at this. They looked at several hundred polls, and on the late-deciding voters, that turned out to be an important factor. So if you look at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, obviously 4 really close states and decisive states in the election, between 11 and 15% of the voters said that they finally decided for whom to vote in the last week before the election. And of that group, in Wisconsin, there was a 30-point spread in favor of Trump. In Pennsylvania and Florida, a 17-point spread, and Michigan, 11-point spread. So that was his margin over Hillary among those voters. And so if you were to take those late deciding voters out, you would have Hillary winning both Florida and Wisconsin probably. Trump probably still wins Michigan and Pennsylvania, but that still flips the election. Right? If Florida goes the other way, Wisconsin goes the other way, it's 271 to 267 Hillary. The late deciding voters, obviously the most difficult to capture in a poll, unless you're polling right at the last minute, were decisive in a couple of these states, it looks like, at least. Now, interestingly enough, of course, if you think about how that relates to this election, there's been a lot of surveys that suggest that people have their minds made up, right? So is there that group to break at the last minute that might break in the direction of President Trump? And the other factor, as you think about this time around, it's typical that late deciding voters break in the direction of the challenger rather than the incumbent. Now, of course, Hillary wasn't the incumbent, but her party was the incumbent party. And so it wasn't surprising that the late breakers went in favor of a change. Normally, you know enough about the party in power, you have your opinion about them perhaps decided earlier. If you're undecided, it's more likely you're going to break in favor of the challenger if the challenger seems like a plausible contender.
The only thing I'd say on that, Matt, is that it seems to me it's odd because Donald Trump is the president. It seems to me, just from the words he uses, the language, the narrative of the race, that he's the non-establishment candidate still, and that Joe Biden is the establishment candidate. So if you did have those late-breaking voters, go for the challenger, to me, I understand challenger to be anti-establishment. So when you were going through kind of what happened in 2016, I can see that happening again. I think that it could be a very good final week of the campaign for President Trump because he's able to draw in anti-establishment vote from perhaps individuals without a college education who then show up at rural polling places, and there's a lot of energy there for his candidacy that allows him to go over the top and to have a very different result than what we're seeing in these polls. So to me, I could very well see something happening in 2020 because of the dynamic that you spelled out for 2016 that explains why the polls were so off.
No, that's a fair point. And it's certainly the way that in the second debate in particular, President Trump was presenting himself, right, as this challenger of the establishment, the inside interests, the swamp, and kind of using that language. I'm not a politician. You're a politician. You've been there 47 years. So it's possible that somehow he's an incumbent who's still an outsider and might be perceived in that way. I think the question of whether there's a lot of people that are undecided, I think, is an interesting one. It seems like, again, if you trust the polls that we've seen on this, that there's a surprisingly small number of people that seem to be saying they're undecided. The second factor that you mentioned a minute ago was education level. So in the past, this hadn't really been important. It's typical when a pollster does a poll that they don't actually get the sample that they want. Most people don't answer the phone. Most people will refuse to answer the questions. So you get what you get. And then what they do is they adjust based on a model, a statistical model that they have going into this and say, okay, we want this profile of people. And so the difficulty is if there's factors that you're not aware of that are influencing a vote, then you might scale up from this number of Republicans to the full number of Republicans and not actually get a right appreciation of the population as a whole, or this group based on men versus women, or whatever the subcategories are that you're looking for to fill out your sample. So there were a number of polls, especially state level polls, that didn't look at the issue of education. And the reason they hadn't done that, and this is Andy Smith, who runs the UNH poll up there at University of New Hampshire. He talking about why his final poll was 11 points off. He had Clinton winning by 11 points. She barely won. It was by 0.4%. He went back and noted the fact that he hadn't done anything about education, and that in the past that hadn't mattered because it was typical for the least educated and the most educated to vote more or less the same way. So you tend to get an oversample in a poll of the highly educated, an undersample of the less educated, but it doesn't really matter because those highly educated people represent on their political preferences the less educated well. But that's not what they found in 2016. And so, having not weighed by the level of education in producing the final results of his final poll, he ended up being off. And when he went back and did that, then they found that that essentially accounted for all of the difference. So making that one correction took the poll from being 11 points off to being a dead heat, which is to say essentially accurate. So that clearly was an important factor. And all the major pollsters now say they've got that part of their formula. They're taking that into account. So they're not going to repeat that mistake. The third issue is those voters that only revealed their preference, their actual preference, after the election. And so that's where we come up with this issue of the shy voter and whether there's such a thing as that. Is that a common thing? Are there those that feel social pressure? They don't want to admit they're in favor of the unpopular candidate. And they did some research around the question, basically, do you get better results if you have a robocall versus a live call? And the theory is, if there's this shy voter effect, you wouldn't mind sharing your opinion with robo-poll where it's not a person on the other end, but in a live interview, you'd be more shy. And so there should be a difference there. Those polls that did the robocalls should be more accurate than the ones that took a live sample. And when they did the research, they didn't find that. That at least line of evidence wasn't there to support the idea that there were a substantial number of shy voters. So doesn't mean that that's not able to be captured somewhere else, but that hypothesis was not confirmed in the direction of there being a substantial number of people who don't want to tell a live person what they think about the race. Now, they went on and they looked particularly at the successes of Trafalgar and noted that they'd gotten these key battleground states correctly. But what they found, which is interesting, is that their overall accuracy in terms of the numbers, final numbers in Trafalgar versus the final numbers in the various battleground states that they polled, that they weren't especially better than the other polls. It's just they were wrong in the opposite direction. So they got the states right because they estimated, for example, Florida 3 points higher than Trump actually got. And so because he won by a razor-thin margin, their prediction was on the right side, therefore their prediction was correct. But the other state-level polls weren't more inaccurate. They may have been 3 points off as well, but they were 3 points off on the underside for Trump. And so a consequence of the fact that he won narrowly, they look like they're more wrong because they predicted the wrong winner, whereas numerically, it's basically a dead heat between them. So it wasn't that Trafalgar was especially more accurate than other state-level polls in the sense of closer to the actual final results, but they consistently favored Trump when the other polls were wrong in the opposite direction. And so, again, going back to their different methods and the different approach they took, one thing which you mentioned before, Dave, which was part of Trafalgar's approach, was to expand the group that they were polling and to consider the possibility that Trump might bring people back into the voting booths who hadn't voted in a while. Mm-hmm. And so they looked at voters that other pollsters wouldn't really bother polling because they vote so infrequently. They figure, well, they're not going to get involved in the election. And that group seems to have had some impact on the race, that there were people that maybe had never voted or had voted infrequently, who were alienated from the system, who were attracted by Trump, who were motivated by Trump. And therefore that group, which obviously broke in his direction, then wasn't taken into account by the pollsters, which then led them to have less confidence in a Trump victory than was warranted by the actual circumstances on the ground.
Yeah, I think there's something to that voter, because for me, elections are won by getting people to come out and vote for you on the basis of them saying, well, why does my vote matter? And I think a lot of people in the past don't vote because they don't believe that their vote is going to matter. And I think to the degree that a Trump or a Biden wins next Tuesday, it's really on that basis of, I have to vote for Trump or else this is going to happen to the country, or I have to vote for Biden or else this is going to happen to the country. And that's to me why I can't quite understand, and maybe there isn't a difference in enthusiasm, but it surely seems that way when you look at the difference between Trump's events and Biden's events. Maybe we're making too much of that, but the enthusiasm difference between the two campaigns is dramatic. And I just, looking at those polls, it just don't seem to line up with the country and the people that I see that are around me. And I'm not simply around, red state Republicans. But to me, that just looking at that and then looking at how the race is being monitored, how the race is being presented, looking at the coverage of events, and that seems to be skewed. I mean, not seems to be, it is skewed. The way that the whole thing is presented to the American people is skewed. The whole way that things are censored on Facebook and Netflix. If Trump is doing so poorly, why are you going that extra step to make sure that he loses? So I just think that the state is much more, the race is much more in flux than people have it right now. So.
Yeah, and speaking of people, so one more person who's more confident this time around, Derek Thompson, writing at The Atlantic, basically trying to calm down Biden supporters, says that 2020 will not be a repeat of 2016, and he gives 5 reasons, which are related to the points we've just been talking about. So the first is that the major pollsters have all fixed their education problem, so they're taking that into account. They won't be blindsided by the fact that President Trump attracts a large number of voters who aren't college educated. Number 2, again, he says that success Trump had with undecideds will not be replicated this time around, in part because there's so few undecideds. Thirdly, he argues that if you look at the polls, it's been remarkably stable. And if you go back to the beginning of the campaign, in essence, the day of the Iowa caucuses, Biden's had, at least national polls, a 4-point lead or better that entire time. And if you go back in 2016, it was up and down. There were points where they were tied. There were points where Hillary was substantially ahead. So the race, even through COVID, through George Floyd, through all the events of the last 6-9 months, so many big events, it's been remarkably stable, he argues, and therefore there's reason to believe that stability will continue right through Election Day. The other thing he mentions, which we haven't talked about, is that if you look at congressional level polling, there were some signs of trouble in 2016 for Democrats, and he cites some studies or conversations that were had as people looking at congressional level polling and seeing districts they thought were safely Democratic closer than they expected, were putting up the alert and saying, watch out, we've got a problem here. They're not finding that at that level this time around. So the same kinds of results are not appearing. If anything, things seem to be moving in a Biden direction at those district level polls, according to Thompson's research. And then lastly, he says the pandemic, that this is a key voting issue, that it's getting worse. The President Trump's position on this has been it's getting better and success is right around the corner. And the question is that persuasive to people, especially in some of these battleground states where the rise in cases has been substantial in the last few weeks, and it's feeling on the ground may not share the optimism of the president on that point.
Yeah, or it could go in the opposite direction as well. There could be people who are wanting optimism, even maybe just hoping for it, even if that's not what they're seeing in front of them, that might turn out for Trump. I think these are good points. I think that you could say that Democrats have learned their lessons from 2016. They've poured money into states and areas that they thought were just gimme in 2016. So it seems to me those things could have been easily corrected, and hence the polls are showing that correction. But I still wonder whether or not this thing is being presented, fairly and honestly in terms of the numbers.
Yeah, well, look, that's a fair point, because I think what we've seen is that some of these gatekeeper institutions, which were willing to at least do some things on the level in the past, have decided that all bets are off, everything's fair game when it comes to President Trump. That just seems like, the New York Times, the sort of the classic story earlier this week, as we find out who this anonymous senior official was who wrote the scathing editorial 2 years ago and followed up with a book. And we were assured there's this really high-level person in the Trump administration who's trying their best to save the world from President Trump. And there's a group of them in there, and we can be confident that at least they're trying and be thankful for them. Well, it turns out to be a guy who's deputy chief of staff for the director of Homeland Security, 30 years old. And this is your senior administration official. So, okay, if you're going to put the finger on the scales that way, right, how much are you willing to do in order to get Trump out the door? I think that's a fair question. Are we at a point where we can just trust that the internal integrity of pollsters and people presenting these models is such, right? They care enough about being right that they'll let the chips fall where they may. And I think you'd probably say that historically. We expect that. They have their own professional integrity and expectations. And if you look at the poll numbers in 2012, they were wrong, but they were wrong in underestimating President Obama's support. Right? So it's not like we have a history where every 4 years Republicans outperform their polls. But is there something about Trump? Is it about either the Trump voters or the response in elite institutions to President Trump that changes the ballgame? That's what we don't know. And obviously we can't know until we see the results on Tuesday or 2 months from Tuesday, whenever it turns out to be.
Right. And that antagonism has grown, not dissipated, since he became president. So the fear that you're not having a right representation of where things stand has only grown in my eyes. I wonder whether or not what's being shown to us is actually what the truth is. So
I think we have reason to be suspicious. I think there's good reason to think that at least the pollsters are aware of the problems that led them to erroneous results last time. And I think, again, even if you took the Trafalgar polls, they're not great for President Trump. If Trafalgar is right on the nose, then there's still some states that are really close that he needs to win. And so it's not like that's a slam dunk. Cahaly was talking about Trump winning in the 270s to low 280s. And obviously that means you're down to a single state flipping the thing in a number of cases. Well, let's try to get another take on this. So let's move beyond the polls. What's another way of getting a state of the race? Well, one thing that can be valuable, because we know that these campaigns are doing internal polling. And so one thing that's maybe indicative of where they think the race is where they're going. We've got so few days left in the campaign. You got 4 days, including today, to campaign, and then that's it. So where are they? So here's President Trump's schedule. Today, he was in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota.
I find it interesting that he's still working hard on Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I think that tells us something, right? That if you have a lot of events there, he thinks that his pathway to victory goes through the Rust Belt, goes through Big Ten country, and maybe he has something to that in his internal polling.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, so Saturday, he's going to have 3 appearances in Pennsylvania. Sunday, he's back in Michigan, and then Iowa, North Carolina, and Florida. A lot of travel on one day. Helps to have a Air Force One to take you around. Then Monday, he's got 5 events: North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then back to Michigan.
Oh.
Total of 16 events in 4 days, covering 7 states. As you say, most of those in that Rust Belt, Big Ten kind of area, plus North Carolina and Florida. Anything else you make of that distribution of states and what that might say about where they think they've got to win and where they think the race is close?
Surprised there's no Arizona. I know
Yeah.
he won it by a large margin in 2016, and it's considered to be a Republican state. But I'm surprised that he's not getting out there to Arizona. Not to say that he hasn't been this past week or two, but that maybe he's seeing things there that shows that race is turning in his favor. Certainly, the Senate race is getting closer for McSally versus Kelly, and there is a stable group of Republican voters in Arizona. So maybe they think that Arizona is sewn up. But that'd be the one thing that jumps out to me.
Yeah, the other one to me is Iowa, because he won Iowa by almost 10 points last time. And so if he's there in Iowa, that's not great. And it's also suggested, because it's only 6 electoral college votes, that you're anticipating a close race, right? You need those 6 votes, and that you don't feel like they're sewn up. Now, maybe he's trying to help Joni Ernst. That's another possibility. And so, the Republican majority in the Senate is also very important. But we'll see. Now, how about Biden's schedule? A lot of the same states, not surprisingly, but he's going to be today. He was in Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, which was a major set of campaign outings for him. He's had a number of days off, even in the last week or so, but today he had 3 events in 3 states. Tomorrow, 2 events in Michigan, and then Sunday he's in Philadelphia, and Monday, it says, according to the information they're putting out, he's barnstorming Pennsylvania. So I guess hitting a number of different sites or driving around, or I don't know what barnstorming means for Joe Biden in 2020, moving around in Pennsylvania and trying to focus, apparently, his efforts there for the last 2 days of the campaign. You take anything away from that, Dave?
Yeah, no Texas, no Georgia. So I think that's a little bit of a ruse that those states are in play. I don't think they are. I think that if they were that confident about where they were, they wouldn't be reinforcing in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the upper Midwest. So I think that, I see from the Biden schedule that they see the campaign like the Trump team as being close, a close race that's going to be determined by how the Rust Belt votes.
Yeah, Kamala Harris is in Georgia. I think it was today or this weekend. So she's there, but you're right. No Joe Biden there, nowhere in the South, no Florida appearance, which would be another thing you might expect. But it seems like he knows that Trump's going to need either Pennsylvania or 2 out of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to win. And so obviously if he can prevent that by winning Pennsylvania and then 2 of those other states, then that's the race, essentially, unless something very unusual happens in a state that we're not expecting to go in Trump's direction. All right, well, a lot of numbers and analysis here, statistics and statisticians talking about statistics. So let's feed the right brain, or the right side of the brain, a little bit. Kyle Smith, who's the movie critic at large at National Review, dabbles in politics a little bit and has a little bit of fun when he does that. So he wrote a piece today wondering if it's possible that all the statisticians, etc., could be wrong. And this is how he begins. He says, when it comes to polling like Jon Snow, I know nothing. I don't know from statistics. I am so inuberate that I'd have to phone a friend if you asked me what comes between 10 and 12. When it comes to crunching, I choose potato chips over numbers every time. Plus, when it comes to politics, I'm hopeless. I predicted both that Donald Trump wouldn't run for president and that Democratic voters would find Joe Biden's creepy behavior around women disqualifying. Live and learn. Biden is way ahead. And he is certainly going to win, right? I'm all about stories, not numbers. True, the plural of anecdotes is not data. So nothing I have to say can possibly have any value whatsoever. When the whiz kids say President Trump has a 13% chance to win re-election, listen to them. Whiz kids are never wrong. But when I look at President Trump, I see a guy who is trying so hard to get the girl, the voter, that he wears her down till she gives in just to shut him up. And so he goes on, and he sort of adds the style of the Trump campaign, which he thinks speaks to something fundamental in the American character. And so he says, even when we're getting kicked in the teeth, we've still got dragon energy. Viral attack, Islamic attack, Martian attack, whatever. It's still America. Pedal down, open throttle, forward thrusting, Red Bull America. Do we really want to give up the top prize to the nice old gentleman whose argument is that he's quiet? We built this country on rock and roll, not Muzak. Donnie T is facing Kenny G.
Kyle is a great writer, and for those of you who don't read him, you should add him to your list of regular reads. I think there's something to it, and what's he getting at? Just the spirit of what you see around you doesn't match the spirit of what's being presented to you, or in the spirit of what's being presented to you. It's a safe country versus kind of the America that you know it and that you're seeing, in your regular life. I mean, I've mentioned Texas many times on the show. The America that I see in Texas is very different than the America that's presented to me on TV.
Well, so he goes on and he kind of picks out different items that he's noticed in the news that just give him pause in accepting the narrative that this is going to be a slam dunk victory for Joe Biden. So he mentions, first of all, that Biden's going to be in Minnesota. I said, well, isn't Minnesota supposed to be solid Democrat country? He mentions there was a New York Times employee who said that went home to Pennsylvania and just couldn't believe all the Trump people that were around him. And this was suburban Philadelphia, right? Suburbs of Philadelphia. He mentions Don Lemon of CNN, who was saying he had to cut off some friends because he had too many friends who were Trump supporters. And you think, really? CNN anchors have a lot of Trump supporting friends? That seems improbable. You give that credit for having those kind of friendships, at least until now, because my guess is that there aren't too many anchors at the networks who could say that. They would have to cut off friends because of their Trump support. They probably don't know Trump supporters. Then there's a poll out that the majority thinks Trump will win. So is that about polls and suspicion over 2016, or is that people sensing something that's actually there? There's a poll that says 56% of Americans think they're better off now than 4 years ago. It's really amazing that that's the case.
What's amazing, they allowed that number to be put in print.
Yeah.
It's just that you're surprised that, some media censor didn't we can't put that out there. That just, that's not the narrative we're trying to put forth. So anyway,
and you wonder if Trump even believes it because he doesn't even say it, right? I mean, you would think that was of course the classic line of Reagan's 84 campaign, morning again in America, but are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that was how he made the pitch in 80 that you're not, and then 84 that you are. And you would think if you have a poll as strong as that, 56% certainly outpolls President Trump on many, many issues, you'd be trumpeting that, but he hasn't. And then, there's some self-evident sense in which you say no one's better off now than they were 4 years ago, given COVID-19 and all the rest. But yet there's some underlying sense in which a majority of Americans say, yeah, no, it is better. So there's an optimism there, to get back to your point earlier, that people are seeing something that's not actually their experience in the moment, but they're seeing beyond that to something that's better than what they imagined they were experiencing or were experiencing 4 years ago. And he goes on, but you get the sense of this, that what he's looking at is not really some of the things you're talking about, not so much the numbers, but what are the stories? Where's the energy as the campaign moves forward? So he says, foolishness, as he concludes all of this. Biden is going to win easily. Definitely. Probably. Right? All right, we're going to move now to our required reading. And Dave, I'll let you lead us through that. We're going to go a little different direction from usual this week, but I think one appropriate for the election season.
Yeah, I had a hard time trying to come up with a great text from the Western corpus on elections. So I figured, why not instead just have a little fun with the required reading, and we could each give a recommendation as to what we might recommend people read depending upon the outcome on Tuesday. So a Biden win, recommendation X, a Trump win, recommendation Y, contested, a third recommendation. How's that?
Sounds great. So just to say, I'm drawing my inspiration from a statement that came out yesterday from Scholars and Writers for America. And there's 94 signatories on this statement, basically endorsing President Trump, including many that we know and admire. Hadley Arcus, our old teacher, Dr. Angela Codavilla, Larry Arnn, plus 10 others from Hillsdale College, and more or less the whole Claremont Institute stable. So the West Coast Straussians are definitely out in force in favor of Donald Trump. And the statement includes this great line. It begins, "Given the astonishing success of his first term, we believe Donald J. Trump is the candidate most likely to foster the promise and prosperity of America." I really like that, astonishing success. If I were a serious Straussian, I'd be thinking about that word astonishing and just how that works. It's not quite the same thing as overwhelming success or measurable success, but it leaves a little bit of Straussian wriggle room.
Exactly. No, I think that many in that crew did not expect President Trump to deliver, on some of the most important policy issues that he did. It's not, and it's not a comprehensive success or overwhelming success in every area, but yeah, there's definitely some Straussian wiggle room. I'd agree with you there. And what is it? 2 sentences. So a 2-sentence statement of unity. That's good. Right.
We urge you to support him as we do. There you go. You got the whole statement.
But I'll stick with the Straussian theme. I think, Flight 93 election, I'm one of those individuals that think that if Joe Biden wins, the Democratic Party, being drawn to the very far left, will continue down a road, especially if it has a Senate majority, that will deliver us an America that is very different than the one that we have today. So I don't say this tongue in cheek, but I think that what you might recommend for reading if Biden wins is Leo Strauss's Persecution and the Art of Writing. We already feel a little bit of that in higher ed anyway, but it may be something that we need to learn how to do more broadly, especially if they're going to publish anything that we put out there.
All right. Well, I'm going to recommend another Straussian, Thomas West, The Political Theory of the American Founding. Will be a good time if Biden wins to reacquaint yourself with the ideas that were rejected and that have been rejected by the progressive movement for the last 100 or so years. Very scholarly but accessible summary of the founders' ideas on their own terms and their own words, and glances at the kind of big issues of our day. So it's got something to say about contemporary questions, but doesn't focus on that at the expense of giving an accurate and compelling rendering of the founders' views. Interesting, he's not on the list. Also at Hillsdale, not sure what to read into that.
Well, my disputed result required or recommended reading would be something very, very long that gets you through this winter. I don't know. I forget how Joe Biden phrased it the other day, but a cold or dark or awful winter.
Right.
So I'm going to go with War and Peace, about 500,000 words long, probably enough to take you through the third week of January, but it's got to be a long reading to kind of make your way through.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm not quite so highbrow, so I'm going to do Dickens' David Copperfield, almost as long, not as long as War and Peace, but it's a good 850 plus pages, so that'll keep you occupied. You got some great characters in there. Copperfield himself, Uriah Heep, Mr. Macabre. I think there's a little bit of Mr. Macabre in Trump. Kind of something's going to turn up to win this election. So we'll see. But I think David Copperfield might be a good companion as you wait out the lawsuits and the recounts.
Okay, and a Trump win, which everyone says is not going to happen. I'm going to go with Augustine's City of God, and the reason why I'm going to go with that is it's very important, even in victory, to remain humble, and that we mentioned this a couple shows that. Where's our humility come from? It's a realization that we never measure up to God's perfect justice and wisdom. And if we make all of our victories in this world to be permanent and to be of the utmost importance to us, then we forget of Christ's victory on the cross years ago. So,
well, now I'm in an awkward spot. Can't beat that. So I'm just going to recommend a couple of the writers that were on the list. and we know well and admire, and would be excellent sources for understanding what's going on in the Trump movement. And also, as you look at the changes on the Supreme Court, what might happen if Roe versus Wade is overturned. So Dr. Angelo Codavilla, our great mentor and teacher, wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Ruling Class, at the point where the Tea Party movement was emerging. And really, a lot of what he writes there is anticipates the Trump movement as well, the revolt against this bipartisan ruling class. And then from Hadley Arkes, a number of good choices, well, both of them, number of great books to choose among, but Natural Rights and the Right to Choose, which he wrote about 20 years ago now, which very interesting combination of things. The first part of the book is basically a philosophical argument showing how natural rights and the right to choose are incompatible, that you have to choose one. You want to have the natural rights system of the founders. You can't tack on to that a right to an abortion. Those two things are mutually exclusive. And then the second part of the book is the story of the Born Alive Infants Protection Act, which Arkes was the lead champion of. And it shows kind of how you make political progress. And as we move into an era where maybe that's possible, it'd be an interesting narrative of how that happened and the way that Arkes and political actors were involved in moving in the direction of reinvigorating a culture of life in the United States.
Those are great choices, Matt. I think one of the interesting things, right, that if Donald Trump does win, he's going to win because regular people have rejected a ruling class presentation on the country. And it's just not simply enough to gain, victory in an election, but what does equality mean rightly understood? And I think people like Professor Codavilla and Professor Arkes are true believers in equality and in policies that speak to that natural human equality and a place where we ought to go if we're going to fully realize what we are our potential as a country. So those would be great readings for where we can go from now if Trump is able to win an election on this type of equality.
All right, very good. So that leads us to our grade book, and we're going to give final campaign grades for the two candidates. So, Dave, let's start with President Trump.
This is going to surprise some people. I'm going to vote for President Trump on Tuesday. I have voted. I've already filled out my absentee ballot in Texas. But I do not think that he ran a good campaign. He was undisciplined. I think that he relied too much upon his own person. He made the campaign about his own person for reasons that we discussed last week. And I think that the arguments that he had to make were very good arguments that could have been made. I truly believe that some of the policies that he's implemented have been good. I'm a little bit different from people here. I think that his courageous, some people call it irresponsible, way of dealing with COVID could point us forward in terms of kind of our limitations as to how we deal with disease and our need to live thereafter anyway. So I think that this election that's so close that many people believe that he has no way to win could have been a landslide election were it not for Donald Trump, the person. And and then someone could respond to me, well, you need to have that little Donald Trump in order to get to this point. But, at what point, could he have just put the brakes on his own person, whether it's a debate or whether it's the way he phrases something that would have made it just kind of a no-brainer. Like, of course I'm going to vote for his reelection. And that just hasn't happened. So I'm going to give him a D, Matt, for the campaign that he's run. I just don't think it's been up to par.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to give him a C, and some of the same reasons that you're suggesting. I think on a couple of policy levels, he's really kind of stepped on a case, as you say, that he could have made. I think healthcare is one where if he loses this, that could be the issue that he really missed a chance on, because He had a vision, repeal and replace, right? That was the whole campaign in 2016, repeal and replace Obamacare. And you repeal, but you didn't replace, and you don't have a plan. And, even with the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, all this talk about the Supreme Court or overturning Obamacare, it's such a long shot. It's just not going to happen. But because he didn't have a plan, all he would say over and over again is, well, we're going to make sure you have better health care for less money. Well, maybe you will, but you've got nothing in terms of the specifics of the plan. You've had 4 years to put it together. So I think that was a real unforced error. I think some of his rhetoric around COVID has been mistaken. It's just, how many times can you tell us that the end is near and then have the end not be near and not look incompetent? And meanwhile, behind the scenes, the administration's really done some amazing things with logistics. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the development of the vaccine and just the remarkable achievement that would be if it's able to happen on the timeline we're talking about. So there's really a story there to be told, but all you hear about is the predictions that are not really grounded in the reality as people are experiencing it. All right, how about Biden?
Yeah, I just Joe Biden's like a kid who doesn't show up at your class, and then comes at the end of the semester and says, okay, can I get credit for this? And you haven't done any of the work. Well, I've been pleasant when the 4 or 5 times I have attended class. Well, no, it's an I for incomplete. It's been an incomplete campaign. To think that he's running to become leader of the free world and has done as little as he's done through November just shows of others' lack of confidence in him, and perhaps what other people are saying, that he just doesn't have the right stuff to be president. And so my I, or incomplete, that I'm going to give Joe Biden will be tied to the bonus of what I'll give the media on this, that they've just allowed him to have an incomplete. They've told us that better to elect someone who's given an incomplete performance than Trump, just because Trump is Trump. So an I is my grade, Matt.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to grade him more from the perspective of how he's campaigned toward victory. And so from that standpoint, I think I'm going to give him a B minus. He's basically used COVID to try to kill the clock. He's had this lead, as we were talking about earlier, at least in the national polls, the entire campaign. And if things break for him the way the polls suggest, then you can say, well, we really didn't get a fair shot at him. The media didn't challenge him. He didn't do the work, as you say, but it might still be successful. I think the other thing that he hasn't done, which he will regret, not November 4th, but into his presidency, if there is one, he hasn't built a mandate for the progressive policies that he's likely to try to implement. He's tried to deny that he's going to do that. Right? He's like, it's Joe Biden, I'm running the Democratic Party, not at AOC, not Bernie Sanders. Well, fine, but we all know that the agenda that's going to be put forward in the Congress will be a left agenda, not a moderate agenda. And so if that gets pushed through, suppose the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and of course have the presidency, if that gets pushed through, I would expect a 2010-like bloodbath in 2022 for the Democrats, right? That a Republican takeover of the House and the Senate, and a real challenge then that would result from that in the second half of a Biden term.
Yeah, I still stick with my I. I mean, I get what you're saying there, that it's been a good hustle. So you got to give credit where credit's due to a good hustle, and maybe that's the reason for the B minus. But it's when we are being hustled.
Yeah, I hear you.
It's the issue.
We've been there, right? We are that professor when someone tries to play that game. So there's no question about it. All right. So you mentioned the media, right? Extra grade for the media, who's been at least as active in this campaign as Joe Biden has been. So I think I know your grade, but go ahead and hit us with it anyway.
I mean, they have been the Biden campaign. The media, which is meant to be objective and neutral, and this great spirit of liberty and that comes with the free press, or should come with the free press. And is there a free press anymore? If the press is enslaved by an ideology so much so that it won't report, it won't cover, then where I think that the reckoning there with the press, that's the most disturbing thing for me. There's just how that great institution of the free press is no longer there, just as it's not present any longer in American society. And I think that'll be the more troubling outcome of this election, is what happens over the next 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think there's going to be some institutions that pay a price for this. I think Twitter in particular is going to pay a price. And certainly if Donald Trump loses, so he's not on Twitter all the time, then I think conservatives will abandon Twitter en masse. And the New York Post, at least the last time I saw, had still chosen not to reactivate their Twitter account. Right? They had their account down for a number of days. They've been told by Twitter, all you have to do is delete this old tweet, putting out the story about Hunter Biden's laptop, resend the exact same tweet again with our new rules that'll go through, and you're back in good standing, and they've refused to do it.
Good for them.
Yeah,
good for them. Yep.
Which suggests to me that they found that they don't need Twitter. And, it's emperor has no clothes kind of moment. If a major newspaper like New York Post decides we don't actually need Twitter, we thought we did. We thought social media was so critical to us getting our stories out there, but we found other ways to do that. That there's going to be a lot of people that'll say, I'm not sure I do need Twitter. And if Twitter just becomes kind of a niche left-wing echo chamber, that's not going to be the kind of role it's played in our politics over the last couple of cycles. All right, last but certainly not least, we had the Tocqueville's crystal ball, and we're going to mercifully take a break from sports this week. So last week, we were on both sides of every game, and so that worked out. So we couldn't have a losing week overall. I was actually worried that one of these games was going to hit the point spread right on the number, so we'd both lose. But it didn't happen. I was 3-2, you were 2-3, so I'm 21-14 overall, you're 12-23. But we'll put that on hold. With one caveat, I do want to note that before the baseball season started, I predicted the Dodgers would beat the Tampa Bay Rays in the World Series. While we're all in mourning over the end of baseball season and the long, dark winter that's ahead of us, I will at least have the consolation of knowing that I predicted the winners, even though my beloved Red Sox were horrific this year.
You had it. And I think that of all the sports that I've watched, the one that came closest to the integrity of the sport played non-COVID it seemed to be baseball to me. Like there were some exciting games there. Yeah. And so anyway, I thought it was a really great playoff series, and it was interesting, right, that the best teams did advance.
We are going to predict the results of the election. We're going to talk about 10 battleground states. So if you go to RealClearPolitics, they start with 232 electoral college votes in the Biden column that are sort of solidly Biden, and 125 for Trump. And that leaves 11 toss-up states. Now, one of those is Texas. But we have it on your assurance, Dave, that Texas is not going blue. So we're going to put that over in the Trump column, which means we're at 232 to 163. And then we've got these two individual congressional districts, Nebraska and Maine. We're going to kind of set those aside, give one to each of them. Looks like that's probably how it's going to land. And so now we're at 233 to 164. So now we've got 10 states. And what I need you to do, Dave, is tell me who wins, and I'll say who I think is going to win. And we'll kind of keep a running tally of what that means for the overall election. We'll look at the numbers at the end. So let's start with the Sun Belt. Arizona, 11 electoral college votes. Latest polling average, RealClearPolitics, it's a complete toss-up. What do you think?
I think that Trump is coming on strong. It's a regular Republican, consistent Republican state. So I think that Trump takes Arizona. It'll be closer than ever before, maybe a point and a half, but I think that he takes Arizona and gets those 11 electoral college votes.
I agree with you. I think that one's going to break in his direction. Close, but not blue yet. Okay, number 2 is North Carolina, 15 electoral college votes. The average poll right now, Biden ahead by 0.7. Very, very close.
Similar to Arizona, I think Trump surge at the end. I don't think the Cal Cunningham events have helped in that race. I thought earlier that he could have been a good support for Biden in the state. He's still polling fairly well, but I think that state goes to Trump as well. 15 to Trump, North Carolina.
Okay. Yep. I agree with you on that one as well. Yeah. What I'm thinking about is if Republicans privately at least are worried about Trump losing, and my guess is that Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate are, that the effort will be really to try to save the Senate. And so some of these states where there's some close incumbent Senate races, I would expect Republicans to put a lot of effort into those states, and that might be enough, hopefully, to get those senators through, but it might also be enough to put Donald Trump over the top. So I think North Carolina as well. So Georgia, 16 electoral college votes. Again, very, very close. Biden, latest polling average, up by 0.4 points.
Yeah, I mean, that's one place where I see that poll, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Georgia, I think, Trump will win Georgia by 3-4 points, I would say.
Okay, I'm also going to say Georgia goes to Trump. Now we go out west again, hot, but not a traditional red state, Nevada, with 6 electoral college votes. Biden currently +4 in the average poll out there.
I think Biden will probably win by more than 4. I see Nevada continuing to trend Democratic, so that's I put that Nevada 6 electoral college votes in Biden's column.
Okay, so we agree again. I think that's too much of a margin for Trump to overcome. I think those votes go to Biden. All right, now we are getting to the main event. We've got Florida and then the Midwest. So let's start with Florida. 29 electoral college votes. We looked at this some weeks ago and just how close it's been election after election and how important it's been. Basically, it's almost a certainty if you win Florida going back decades, you win the election. Right now, Biden is polling plus 1.2 points on average. What do you think, Dave?
I think here is a place. Florida is a place where Trump wins solidly. These are usually squeakers in Florida, but I do think that the Latino vote, the Cuban vote in Florida seems to be, if not pro-Trump, not for Biden. So I think that Trump takes Florida.
I'm going to go the other way on that one. So I think Biden gets Florida. There's been a lot of close victories for Republicans in Florida over the years, and Florida tends to go with the overall victor. By the time we get to the end, you'll see I'm predicting a Biden win overall. So I think Florida is close, but Trump loses. All right, so now we come to the Midwest, and we will start with Iowa. 6 electoral college votes. Latest poll numbers, Biden plus 1.2 points.
Iowa, Trump. I sound like a broken record here. So he's kind of has to thread this needle, and I think Iowa's one of those places a little bit easier to thread. So I think he wins Iowa.
Yeah, I think he can hold on to Iowa. Joni Ernst seems to be getting in a stronger position. Saw there was a poll out today where she was up by 2 points, so that will also be helpful. I think he's able to hold on to Iowa, but it will be a matter of concern if, again, 9.5 point victory there last time, and you're looking at a close race this time around. Now we come to Pennsylvania, the state that a lot of these projectors say this is the whole thing. Is Pennsylvania going to decide the election? That seems to be a lot of people's surmise. Who wins Pennsylvania, Dave?
I think that Joe Biden takes Pennsylvania. I think that he's different than Clinton and will be received better by Pennsylvanians. And I don't think he'll win by much, but I think he'll definitely take Pennsylvania. So he'll get that back from the Clinton loss in 2016.
I've been shocked. I thought Pennsylvania, with all the fracking, with the oil, that the polls would move, and they just haven't seemed to move. So I agree with you. He's got this consistent margin of 3 or 4 points. Even if it closes a point or two, he still wins narrowly. I think Pennsylvania goes to Biden. Wisconsin, 10 electoral college votes. Biden up 6.4 points in the latest average.
Yeah, this is going to be the most risky pick that I make, but what I'll say from Wisconsin, I'll say from Minnesota and Ohio. I just think that, and this goes back to something I said earlier in the show, there's something going on in the American electorate, especially among those voters who may not have voted before, where they just don't want to choose kind of a Joe Biden presidency. So I think they come out of the woodwork. I think they do so in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio. I think those will carry Trump across the finish line. He's gonna do well in those Rust Belt states.
We can pick them all together if you want. I'm going to say he's going to lose all three of those states. Wisconsin and Minnesota, the margins are fairly substantial. Minnesota, it's also 10 electoral college votes. Biden up by 4.7 points, latest polling average. I think that's just too big a margin. I don't think the polls are that far off. So again, even if there's a little bit of movement in the direction of Trump, I think that Biden still wins those states. And then I guess where I'm going out on the limb is Ohio. I think Ohio, which was a big Trump win last time, ends up being a narrow Biden win this time. And so those 18 electoral college votes are kind of the icing on top of the cake in a Biden victory. All right, Dave, so what's the final number? What have you got?
So I have 279, 259 for Trump. Squeaks out an election victory that should have been much greater were it not for his own person. So, and what does a 20 electoral college vote win mean? Probably that we're disputing the election, for the next couple months. Sorry for the bad news.
Yeah, I've got a number 326 for Biden, 212 for Trump. So fairly similar to last time around, just reversed. But I am going to say, with this emphasis on saving the Senate, that Republicans do get a 51-49 Senate majority coming out of this. And so that will put the brakes on the court packing, the filibuster survives, and Joe Biden's forced to negotiate.
Okay. And the other reward of not having a contested November and December. So that's good. That would be one good thing that came out of that result.
That would be one positive we could take away from that. All right. Well, that's it. We'll see how we do Tuesday night and beyond. Thank you, as always, for listening. Please remember to subscribe and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and Stitcher. We look forward to talking to you next week.